You're listening to Zodiac Speaking, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, DNA ID, Beyond Bizarre True Crime, Scene of the Crime, and 3 Men and a Mystery. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
This is the Zodiac speaking. In this episode, we'll primarily focus on the events that occurred on Washington Street in Presidio Heights on October 11th, 1969, where yellow taxicab driver Paul Stine was murdered by the Zodiac, with one shot to the right side of his head. 2 days after the crime, a letter postmarked October 13th, 1969, arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle, stating, "This is the Zodiac. I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Street and Maple Street last night. To prove this, here is a blood-stained piece of his shirt. I am the same man who did in the people in the North Bay area. The SF police could have caught me last night if they had searched the park properly, instead of holding road races with their motorcycles, seeing who could make the most noise. The car drivers should have just parked their cars and sat there quietly waiting for me to come out of cover. School children make nice targets. I think I shall wipe out a school bus some morning. Just shoot out the front tire, and then pick off the kiddies as they come bouncing out." Some people believe that the Zodiac's use of Washington and Maple was indicative of a killer who wasn't particularly familiar with the area, because the murder occurred 1 block west on Washington and Cherry Streets. We know that the Zodiac was an avid follower of the newspapers, so it's extremely unlikely that he failed to notice the San Francisco Chronicle article on October 12, 1969, which briefly detailed the crime, stating, "Police said 3 youngsters saw a scuffle near the cab, which was stopped on Washington Street near Cherry Street about 10 p.m. Therefore, if the killer was unaware or unsure of the location he had murdered Paul Stine, it wouldn't have been that difficult to just simply copy the newspaper article. But the Zodiac failed to do this, and described the murder over by the Washington and Maple intersection. He had provided us with a piece of Paul Stine's shirt to add credence to his claim of being the killer. So was it simply coincidence that the location of Washington and Maple he provided just happened to match the destination given on Paul Stine's taxicab trip sheet? In other words, was this another layer of proof the Zodiac provided to law enforcement that he was in the taxicab that fateful night? Additionally, we have to consider the possibility he was telling the truth, and the murder of Paul Stine was perpetrated near the intersection of Washington and Maple, which is why no gunshot was heard by the 3 teenagers opposite the crime scene. When we look at the immediate intersections prior to Washington and Maple, and the intersection of Washington and Cherry, it becomes evident that a pre-chosen destination of murder at Washington and Maple, from the standpoint of geography, seems like the safest location to commit the murder without eyewitnesses. A simple comparison on Google Maps between Washington and Maple and Washington and Cherry shows us that the murder 1 block east of the eventual crime scene makes much more sense as a predetermined location.
One debate that has raged for decades is whether the Zodiac killer travelled in the front or back seat of Paul Stine's taxicab. We have to be very careful when assessing people's opinions on this topic, particularly when an individual is promoting the notion of a suspect who possibly knew Paul Stine. They have a conscious bias to argue for a front seat murder to bolster the notion that Paul Stine personally knew his passenger, and therefore deliberately fit the evidence to a conclusion they have already made. The argument of a lack of blood on the passenger seat because somebody was sitting there is a fallacious one. A shot to the right side of Paul Stine's head doesn't produce an inevitable transfer of blood to the front passenger seat of the taxicab. Without witnessing first-hand the crime in progress, I doubt any argument either way will ever fully answer this question to everyone's satisfaction. But here is something to consider concerning bloody fingerprints found by investigators on the exterior front door handle of the taxicab. If the Zodiac killer was a front seat passenger, then he wouldn't have deposited bloody fingerprints on the front passenger door handle on entering the taxicab near Union Square. After shooting Paul Stine and removing a piece of Paul Stine's shirt, he would have every reason to now have some blood on his hands. There may also be a reason to have deposited blood on the inner door handle when exiting the vehicle, but it would have been totally unnecessary to have ever touched the outer front passenger door handle of the taxicab to close the door when exiting. This could have been achieved by using the heel of your hand, your arm, your leg, or your foot. Why close the door and deposit bloody fingerprints on the exterior handle to then have to waste time wiping them off again? The Zodiac killer could have closed the door using the swatch of shirt he had just removed. There would be no reason to leave bloody fingerprints on the outer front passenger door handle unless you had travelled in the back seat of the taxicab. A killer travelling in the rear of the taxicab may have received a small amount of back spatter to the gun and fingers when shooting Paul Stine and putting the gun away. The Zodiac killer could now naturally open the rear passenger door and close it without using his right hand, but the natural way to open the front passenger door would be to use his right fingertips. That almost certainly would have had a fine layer of blood on them. When he wiped down the exterior front passenger door handle when he exited the taxicab, he may have unwittingly failed to remove every bloody fingerprint from the handle. But why would this exterior front door handle ever need to be touched by a stationary fingertip when the Zodiac killer exited the front passenger door by a killer travelling alongside Paul Stine?
Although the majority of blood found on the front of Paul Stine's shirt is on the right side, the left side has formed a pattern of blood similar to the right, to the amount of approximately 2/3. This tells us that Paul Stine did not fall to his right side immediately after the shot was fired, to the position of, quote, his head resting on the floorboard facing north, as described in the police report. The body of Paul Stine must have remained upright for a measurable length of time for the shirt to have received blood patterning, as seen in the photographs. This has led some to believe that maybe the Zodiac did shoot Paul Stine at Washington and Maple, and then entered the front of the taxi, pressed Paul Stine's lifeless body against the driver's door, and coasted the taxicab one further block west. However, a much later interview of the three teenagers suggested an alternative to explain the pattern of blood on the shirt. They said, quote, at this time, Lindsay went downstairs to get a better look at what was happening, while one of the kids upstairs called the police. Downstairs, the lights were off, so Lindsay knew he couldn't be seen from the outside. He got close to the window and watched his actions. He was shortly joined by Rebecca. They both watched and observed in silence as Zodiac pushed the driver to an upright position behind the steering wheel, exited the car, and walked around the rear of the car and opened the driver's door. Stine had fallen over onto the seat, and Zodiac pulled him back into the seated position and had some difficulty keeping him upright. Once upright, he was keen to have a rag or something like a handkerchief and began to wipe down the door area and lean over the driver, part of the dashboard. End quote. This story is corroborated by the blood pattern on Paul Stine's shirt, making a murder one block east not the only possibility. At one point in the night's proceedings, the teenagers described the suspect in the front seat of the yellow cab, mid to passenger side, with the victim slumped partially over his lap. Then came the statement of Officer Armand Palisetti in the 2007 Zodiac documentary, who said, quote, it seemed Officer Falk in that amount of time felt that he had stopped the Zodiac. Well, it's very hard to say if he did or not. Falk was also very clear about what the person was wearing. Well, it just so happens that area is extremely well lit, and I cannot imagine his not seeing the shine of blood on the clothing if it had been Zodiac. These accounts have led people to believe that the Zodiac must have been covered in blood, but the reality is that the Zodiac needn't have had virtually any blood on his clothing that night at all. but it's extremely unlikely, having shot Paul Stine on the right side of his head, that he would then pull Paul Stine's heavily bleeding head into his lap to remove the shirt piece, or any other task he chose to perform. The Zodiac had a considerable distance to walk to either enter a residence or arrive at a waiting vehicle, and I doubt he would have willfully covered himself in blood, when at a bare minimum, he had a 3-minute journey on a well-lit Jackson street. The Zodiac didn't need to get barely any blood on his clothing while removing a piece of Paul Stine's shirt. He may have received some blood transfer, but it's not an inevitable consequence based on the observations from the eyewitnesses and the blood noted inside the taxi when Officer Armand Palisetti arrived at the crime scene.
We also have the question of whether the Paul Stine shirt piece was carefully torn from the victim or whether it was removed using an instrument of some sorts. There are documents stating the shirt piece was torn, but this reference using plain language is less than compelling. What would have been useful is if we had information or a forensic report stating that the margins of the shirt had been microscopically analysed to determine whether the Zodiac killer used his hands or a sharp instrument. This sort of information would have been extremely helpful in narrowing down the type of individual we should be focusing on. Somebody confident enough to rely on their dexterity just moments after the murder could suggest a killer knowledgeable in fabrics or the medical profession, where creating tourniquets and bandages from clothing can be crucial in the field. After all, somebody created the Lake Berryessa costume. After his first 3 communications to the San Francisco Chronicle, San Francisco Examiner and Vallejo Times-Herald on July the 31st, 1969, Vallejo Police Chief Jack Stilts still wasn't convinced the letter writer was the murderer and, quote, urged the writer to send more letters with more facts to prove his connections to the crimes. The Zodiac killer responded immediately with his debut of Zodiac letter offering up more information. This skepticism by Chief Jack Stilts probably prompted the Zodiac killer to leave a message on the car door at Lake Berryessa and then remove a piece of Paul Stine's shirt to prove he was at the Washington and Cherry Street intersection that night. In his October the 13th, 1969 letter, he wrote, "I am the murderer of the taxi driver over by Washington Street and Maple Street last night. To prove this, here is a bloodstained piece of his shirt." With the challenge of Chief Jack Stilts asking Zodiac to prove himself ringing in his ears, it would be no surprise that on November the 9th, 1969, the Zodiac killer would again reference Chief Jack Stilts, stating, "To prove that I am Zodiac, ask the Vallejo cop about my electric gun sight, which I used to start collecting my slaves." So it appeared like it was a predetermined decision to remove something from the crime scene at Washington and Cherry in advance of committing the murder, to prove he, the killer, was also the letter writer. But the Zodiac killer had much easier options than removing a shirt piece from the victim, evidenced by his taking of Paul Stine's wallet and car keys, which would have undoubtedly linked him back to the crime. Yet he chose to carefully remove a section of Paul Stine's shirt, an act that seemed totally unnecessary and time-consuming. It could be argued he was hell-bent on acquiring a grisly souvenir to shock the recipient, and had planned this act of removing a shirt piece long before getting into the taxicab. If this was the case, how could the Zodiac killer, even if accomplished in fabrics or the medical field, know in advance what type of shirt his victim would be wearing? Paul Stine could have been wearing a denim shirt or thick fabric of any material with strong hems, making the removal of a piece of the shirt much more difficult, if not impractical. The only way the Zodiac killer could ensure the removal of his victim's shirt in reasonable time would be to have a backup tool such as a knife or a pair of scissors. The 3 Robbins teenagers who gave a more lengthy statement in later years regarding their observations stated, "We went to the window and saw the driver laying across the front seat, head towards the passenger door. His head was in the lap of another man. Rebecca saw blood and said out loud, 'He's stabbing that man.' She was seeing blood on the victim and saw the glint of a knife, so she assumed a stabbing was taking place. No shots were heard by anyone. We know now that the Zodiac was cutting off a large piece of Stine's shirt with a knife. This statement by the Robbins kids, however, appears to have been widely disregarded.
This small excerpt has been taken from Howard Davis's website, The Zodiac Manson Connection. Quote, "The last issue I wished to discuss was a finding in the coroner's report that I cannot yet resolve. Mr. Stine's lungs were described as follows. Both lungs are moderately increased in weight. There's congestion at the base and dependent portions. Multiple intraparenchymal hemorrhages are noted. The blood in the lungs does not appear to have drained from the head wound. Were this the case, the blood should be in the lung air space, rather than the parenchyma, which is the lung tissue itself. Additionally, the position of Stine's body, with the head approximately at the level of the chest while in the Zodiac's lap, and then below the level of the chest on the floorboard after Zodiac left the scene, would not be conducive to passive blood flow from the head wound into the airspace of the lungs. These kinds of injuries can often be found in victims of auto accidents caused during rapid deceleration or impact to the body. The textbook of pulmonary and critical care medicine is quoted as saying, "Pulmonary contusion is caused by rapid deceleration against a steering wheel, a fall from a height, and from blast injuries." According to the coroner, Paul Stine had multiple intraparenchymal injuries, suggesting his taxi would have experienced rapid deceleration or heavy braking sometime prior to his death. Is it possible that the Zodiac pulled the gun on Paul during the journey, which caused Stine to attempt heavy braking to disarm or disable his passenger, but it failed? This extreme braking at some point during the journey may have caused Stine's chest to strike the steering wheel, and the lung damage that was noted at autopsy. Compression to the chest doesn't necessarily have to include injuries to the skin or ribs. This may also explain why Paul Stine wasn't that particular about how he parked his vehicle near the intersection of Washington and Cherry that night. He could have had more pressing matters regarding a gun pointed to his head. It may also explain why the Zodiac was described as having a lumbering gait, having conceivably struck his legs on the rear of the front seat under heavy braking conditions.
Despite the images of Paul Stine photographed with the taxicab door open and his arm extending outside the vehicle, this is not the position he was left in when the Zodiac killer departed the crime scene or when Officer Armand Palisetti arrived. Officer Armand Palisetti described the position of Paul Stine's body in the police report as, quote, slumped over the front seat with his upper torso in the passenger side, head resting on the floorboard. This can be proved by the two images of the taxicab door taken from an identical position. The first is an image facing into the open door with very little blood on the road west of Paul Stine's left hand. The second image, identical to the first and obviously taken subsequently, shows copious amounts of blood on the road west of Paul Stine's left hand. This shows that Paul Stine's head wound was bleeding onto the road profusely between the taking of these two photographs. Had Paul Stine been left in this position by the Zodiac killer when he departed the crime scene, there would have been a lot of blood on the road before photographers even arrived at the Washington and Cherry intersection, but there was none. The position shown by the photographs in this instance were taken after medical personnel had arrived, rolled Paul Stine into that position to check for vital signs, before stepping away to allow the two photographs in question to be taken. The determination of death was certainly brief because when the medical personnel stepped back, the first photograph only showed minimal drops of blood on the road, likely flicked from Paul Stine's left hand as he is rolled from the front passenger floorboard to the position shown in the first photograph. Sometime later, the second photograph was taken. Some people have suggested that the Halloween card was depicting this image of Paul Stine from the taxicab, but these photographs were not available to the general public by October the 27th, 1970, and the Zodiac killer had left the crime scene before Paul Stine was manoeuvred into this position. So unless the Zodiac killer had inside knowledge of the photographs, the arrangement of the skeleton on the Halloween card has nothing to do with the position of Stine's body shown after medical intervention.
This is the Zodiac speaking.
Right, Mike, a man was seen entering Julius Calm Playground from the standpoint of a murder at Washington and Maple intersection. Makes a lot of sense. The Zodiac killer only has to travel north up Maple and then disappear out of sight by turning east on Jackson to Spruce Street and then into Julius Calm Playground. A killer murdering Paul Stine at Washington and Cherry has to travel 2 blocks east before reaching Spruce Street and Julius Calm Playground, indicating that if a man entering the park was Zodiac, his plans had seemingly changed from a murder at Washington and Maple to a murder at Washington and Cherry. This appears to be backed up by the trip sheet with a destination of Washington and Maple. His statement in the October the 13th letter of a murder over by Washington Street and Maple Street, and the fact that this intersection was, from a geography standpoint, the safer option for murder. Putting this all together, coupled with the sound of a gunshot not being heard by anybody in the near vicinity of Cherry Street, does this suggest the murder could have taken place at the corner of Washington and Maple Street, but something forced the Zodiac killer to take control of the taxicab and relocate it 1 block west? Or are you steadfast on a Washington and Cherry Street murder?
Well, this is a debate that's been going on for a long time. And, I personally, I think it's more likely that he instructed him to go up 1 further block, and drive further. Maybe he saw someone outside, whatever, and decided to go down 1 block and then shot Paul Stine. That's what I think happened. I think it'd be a little bit more realistic and more easy as opposed to Zodiac trying to gain control of the cab as it was coasting and that kind of stuff. So I think personally that's what happened, but it makes sense. We know that in the trip log, he was supposed to stop at Washington and Maple, and that location, as you just mentioned, lines up with the entrance to Julius Calm Playground. Perhaps Zodiac had mapped out in advance that intersection because he could get to the park easily and escape and hide. And he, for whatever reason, decided to go up 1 block. Maybe he saw someone, whatever, and it threw his plan off a little bit.
If you look at the geography of Washington and Maple, and you look at the intersections either side of Washington and Maple, you can clearly see that that's the ideal place for murder, not very close to houses. It's quite a setback a bit. So it's clear that this was the ideal choice along Washington Street within the near vicinity of where the eventual murder took place. So do you think it shows that the Zodiac killer probably knew the area, mapped out the area, and knew this was the ideal place to commit the murder originally?
Yeah, I think he pre-planned it for whatever reason, whether he knew the area, whether he just looked at it on a map and said, okay, where can I escape to where I can get away easily? I think he came to the conclusion that the park's right there, the Presidio's right there. There's plenty of cover if he needs to escape. So that's why it further backs up, in my opinion, that he meant to go to Washington and Maple, make that quick getaway if he needed to, and for whatever reason just had to abort that, go down a block to Washington and Cherry and escape from there and then walk further back to where he originally wanted to go. So to me, it just adds up that that was his original destination, was Washington and Maple.
Because you surely wouldn't have wanted to walk 2 blocks east from Washington and Cherry to the park if that was your original choice. It wouldn't have made any sense, would it?
Yeah, there's just that many more chances to be seen by someone. And if you believe Officer Falk, his account, he was seen by at least him. So it did give him more chance to be seen and more chance to be caught. So I think had he been able to stick to his original plan, assuming that it was his plan to get dropped off at Maple Street, he could have easily been into that park, into that cover without being seen by anyone. But whatever happened, and he was forced to go down a block, I think.
Now, the first wanted poster stated the killer sat in the front seat of the taxicab, tells the driver the destination is Washington and Laurel, or area near the Presidio Park. and upon reaching the destination, orders Paul Stine to continue under gunpoint into or near the park. First of all, investigators couldn't possibly know if the killer rode in the front of the taxicab unless somebody saw him enter the taxicab or saw the taxicab 912 on its journey and recognised Paul Stine at the relevant time. Where did they concoct the destination of Washington and Laurel from when they had the trip sheet stating Washington and Maple, by all accounts, and how could they possibly know if Paul Stine was forced under gunpoint to continue beyond the claimed destination? This wanted poster could not have been created by somebody with even the remotest knowledge of this case. How can a wanted poster such as this make it out into the public domain, carrying so many errors, bearing in mind somebody lost their life that day?
Yeah, I'm a little bit flabbergasted that they put some information out there that they don't back up. No, obviously they don't have to back up, but they may have information. Perhaps Paul Stine called into the cab stand and said something that was not, reported as far as we know. And they have his trip sheet, but there may have been some kind of radio communication as well. Besides that, I don't know. There's no living witness, so I don't know how they could determine, short of an eyewitness, that Zodiac rode in the front, that there's any kind of mention of that, that other street. It's a little confusing, and it's a little bit short on details, unfortunately. But again, the police, we've seen in the past, they put out confusing information, and there may be just some information that they've held back, and it's caused a little confusion.
And the newspaper on October the 18th, one of the editors of the San Francisco Chronicle mentioned the trip sheet and the Washington and Maple destination, but nobody has ever seen this trip sheet other than presumably the police. So are we very confident that this is what was written on the trip sheet, Washington and Maple? Are we confident that was the destination written by Paul Stine?
Well, that's, again, taking the police word for it. Now, Zodiac in his letter wrote over by Washington and Maple. He didn't say over by Washington and Cherry. One reason could be that perhaps when he planned out his escape and planned out this attack on a cab driver, he remembered the name Washington and Maple. He knew that intersection. He may not have taken the time to see what the next street up was. So if he aborted that plan and said, go down one extra block, later on when he wrote his letter, he may not have even looked up at the sign and may not have known what street that he was ultimately stopped at. So that could be further proof of him knowing and mentioning Maple Street, because it was his intended destination all along, and the area he knew where he meant for this attack to happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's further proof that he was the killer, because on October the 12th in the San Francisco Chronicle, it did mention the murder at Washington and Cherry. So he could easily have copied it if he'd have chosen to, but he chose to ignore that and write Washington and Maple. So clearly it might have been just extra evidence. I don't know why he'd need extra evidence on top of the shirt piece, but it seems that way.
Yeah, and if Washington Maple was on the trip log, then that's just further proof. Him mentioning Washington Maple, it would just further solidify that he was indeed the killer.
Now, we're talking about now the three eyewitnesses. It has been claimed by certain individuals that Lindsay Robbins pointed out the killer travelling up Cherry Street to Armand Pellicetti. If this really was the case, why didn't Officer Pellicetti immediately radio this to others so that the killer travelling east on Jackson could be intercepted before he reached the Jackson and Maple Street intersection? Did the young teenager really point the killer out to Pellicetti, or did Pellicetti somehow completely ignore the information he was being told? The Zodiac killer still had a near 2-minute walk to reach the intersection of Jackson and Maple when presumably pointed out by Lindsay. So there was ample time for Pellicetti to radio these details to other officers in the vicinity. Something sounds a little bit off here.
Well, and what we don't have are the good majority of the San Francisco police reports, so we don't know what's accurate, what the first police on the scene, what Falk, what any of them had to say in the reports, because we just don't have access to them. But if we go back to the 2007 documentary, Palisetti doesn't mention the kids telling him, hey, there he goes right there, go chase after him. In fact, there's a little bit of, he's looking at the area, making sure he doesn't get shot, and he comes upon Falk eventually. And, depending on who you believe, they have some kind of conversation. I've come to the point where if I don't see it with my own eyes in some kind of police report, I don't necessarily believe it, because too many people have agendas. Too many people have things that they want to pursue, angles they want to pursue, suspects they want to pursue. So there's a lot of, well, I heard this or so-and-so told me that. If I don't see it with my own eyes, documented someplace, I'm a little bit skeptical about what was really said and what really happened.
It was many years later when the second statement by the Robbins children came out, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I'm a believer in documentation early on. What did the witnesses say? What did the first responders say? What did the police say early on, hours after what they saw? A couple days after they saw, not 40 years or 30 years or 50 years later. I don't put as much stock into that. I believe that what is fresh in people's minds immediately after the fact is what we should rely on. And unfortunately, in the SFPD files, we just don't have access to read a lot of that.
The only reason I placed a little bit of credence on their second statement was they mentioned the killer going round to the driver's side and trying to lever Paul Stine back up into an upright position, which I couldn't understand what the purpose of that was for. But to do such a thing, he would have to brace his right hand on that dividing panel to pull Paul Stine up with his left hand behind the driver's seat, to give himself some leverage. And that would tie in perfectly with that bloody fingerprint on the dividing panel between the driver and rear passenger door. So that's why I gave it some credence, because their statement seemed to match with that print being in that unusual position, because there'd have been no reason for a killer just wandering round, wiping down the driver's side and then exiting to have ever touched that dividing panel between the driver's side door and the left rear passenger door.
Yeah, I think, Zodiac gets a lot of credit for being some kind of master criminal. I don't think he was. I think he made different mistakes, and obviously he left living witnesses. So I wouldn't put it past him to leave a print, despite having this well planned out event. Things happen in the moment and that the planning goes out the window. So I wouldn't put it past him to make a mistake, leave some kind of clue. He could have just shot Paul, got out of the car and walked away and been gone in the darkness. Instead, he chose to mess around, mill around the cab, tear off his shirt, come around to the other side of the cab for whatever reason. So it's just more opportunities for him to make mistakes and leave clues and leave evidence. And I think that's what he did.
We'll come back to that in a while, because there's something else I want to bring up about that. But on October the 22nd, 1969, Eric Wheel rang into the Jim Dunbar show, as we know. The host asked Eric if he had called the program one other time when Belli was a guest. But Eric seemed unsure in his response, saying, "What?" When asked again, with Jim Dunbar saying, "Did you call one other time about 2 or 3 weeks ago?" Eric hesitated and said yes. So he was sort of just going along with the story. The host was asking him this while under the impression that he may have been the Zodiac killer. Therefore, somebody must have rang the Jim Dunbar show between the 1st and the 8th of October, if that 2 or 3 weeks ago was correct, under the Zodiac pseudonym, because they assumed he rang a few weeks ago. Now, this could have been the Zodiac killer ringing the TV station to announce that he was bringing his terror to San Francisco, but may have been rejected as just another hoaxer. If he had failed to appear on the Jim Dunbar show twice after 2 phone calls, including the one to Oakland, he may have decided to no longer announce his crimes because of this failure. If the Oakland PD call was Zodiac, there is a strong possibility he rang prior to the Stine murder also. What are your thoughts on that? Did you ring 2 or 3 weeks ago, which would have placed this call before the Stine murder?
Well, I think it would be interesting because it shows some San Francisco activity going on. No, I think it's also worth noting that there were a lot of people seeking attention, as Eric Wheel himself was, off the Zodiac name. So even if someone called in 2 or 3 weeks earlier saying they were Zodiac and it wasn't Eric Wheel, it doesn't mean it was also the real Zodiac either. So
No.
It's worth noting for sure, but I don't think there's anything to solidly link it to being the real Zodiac.
The only reason I bring it up was because if somebody claiming to be the Zodiac Killer rang up the Jim Dunbar show to ask Melvin Belli, to speak to Melvin Belli between the 1st and the 8th of October, up to this point, Zodiac had never even entered San Francisco, had he? He'd never committed any crimes there at that point. So we can understand that Eric Wheel may have attached himself by doing this hoax after the murder in San Francisco, but attaching himself before the murder of Paul Stine would have been something the Zodiac Killer hadn't done, because he'd never committed any crime in San Francisco at that point.
Yeah, the timing's definitely interesting. It shows interest to that area and maybe seeking more publicity. So I don't think we can rule it out altogether.
Because they quite easily dismiss a lot of these calls as hoaxes, but you can't possibly know the call is a hoax, can you?
No, and I think, we've talked off the air too about different things that we were surprised that the police were dismissive of. They'd hear someone say, this is the Zodiac, or I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. And, whether it's a bombing in another state, a bomb threat, whatever it is, I think they sort of were dismissive, and they should have searched and checked out all possible angles and all leads. So to that point, I think they maybe did a disservice by not chasing down every lead and ruling them out properly.
Now, here's something I find a little curious, that assistant traffic manager of the yellow cab company, Leroy Sweet, stated the last dispatch given to Paul Stine was 9:45 p.m. We have assumed this to be somewhere around the Mason Geary Street intersection or Union Square. The dispatch was to 500 9th Avenue, slightly west of the eventual crime scene. The journey was 3.7 miles. Yeah, this journey would have taken 10 minutes on a busy Saturday night. So Paul Stine should have arrived at 500 9th Avenue at about 9:55 p.m., assuming he left at 9:45, like was stated in the police report. He never arrived at the destination of 500 9th Avenue, so the dispatch was reassigned to another cab at 9:58. So why was Leroy Sweet this impatient to reassign the dispatch when effectively Paul Stine wasn't particularly late? 3 minutes we're talking here. Are you confident that Paul Stine received the 509th dispatch from somewhere near the theatre district? Or could he have received this with the Zodiac Killer in the back of the cab at the time?
Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting to ponder.
Because we've got 10 minutes, haven't we?
Yeah, it's a little confusing. And again, this is, I think, where if we had access to all the SFPD reports and interviews, we could sort of piece together and answer some questions and some speculation and come to some final conclusions on stuff. And I think not having access to that sort of leaves all these questions and this confusion that we're sort of spinning in circles over.
But based on the taxicab meter reading, are you fairly confident that the pickup happened by the theatre district?
Yeah, I tend to think that's where it was. But again, it leaves open the possibility for something else to have gone down.
Now, if we switch, we'll switch a little bit here because I want to compare something that we've discussed in a previous podcast. The autopsy report in the Sherry Jo Bates case is crucial in telling the real story of her murder. So why are the intraparenchymal injuries seen in the Paul Stine autopsy, that is damage to his lungs, not given more credence? If Paul Stine had braked sharply and injured his lungs on the steering wheel of the taxicab along with the dark marks on the dorsal side of his left hand, this may resurrect the idea that Paul Stine had a gun placed to his head prior to his arrival at Washington and Cherry Streets, and he attempted to disarm his assailant by using sharp braking, hence his chest hitting the steering wheel. Shouldn't we put more emphasis on this science rather than the static crime scene?
Well, and again, without having any kind of medical training or expertise, I don't know if we're looking at a situation where when Paul's shot, he slams on the brakes or jolts forward and smashes his chest on the steering wheel. It seems like it could be possible that he could have slammed on the brakes to try and dislodge the gun from Zodiac's hand, maybe. But then again, could he have been in park and when he was shot, he jumped forward and smashed his chest? I think without having the proper medical background to talk about that, I don't know what could be true. But it definitely seems like one way or another, the injury could be related to some impact on the steering wheel.
Because these injuries didn't just appear from nowhere, did they? And I was reading some medical reports, and it did state that you can have injuries to the fine blood vessels and lungs without having any visible external injuries due to compression. So there is a good chance that this autopsy of Paul Stine is telling the true picture of what happened, as opposed to what we've just assumed by looking at the crime scene itself. I don't know how we could take that any further, but it seems like not much attention is ever paid to this autopsy report.
Yeah, I think so many people get caught up in the eyewitness part of it and the Zodiac escaping from the scene and being tracked down. They sort of forget the fine details around the murder itself and Paul Stine's injuries.
A lot of people have thought the dark mark on his hand was him in some way deflecting the gun or bashing the gun away. Have you got any thoughts on that dark mark on his left hand?
Well, I mean, when you hear dark mark, to me, I think of him maybe reaching up to protect himself or grab the gun. And when the gunshot goes off, I could see some kind of powder burns being left on the hand. Could it be, again, without having any kind of specific medical training here, I'm just spitfiring, but could it be him having his hand blocking his head and Zodiac banging the gun on his hand and leaving some kind of mark? I don't know, but it seems like it could certainly be related one way or another to the murder.
Or striking the steering wheel. But I remember Donald Fouke describing the Zodiac leaving the scene as having a lumbering gait, sort of like a semi-limp, I think is what he said. Now, if Paul Stine had braked sharply to disarm the killer, he could easily have struck his legs on the back of the seat, which may have temporarily damaged his legs in some way, which is why he was lumbering away from the crime scene. I don't know if that's a possibility. Yeah,
Donald Fouke's lumbering gait has really caused a lot of debate in this case. I'm not a big Donald Fouke fan. I'm not a big supporter or believer of what he had to say because I go back to what you report very early on is what I believe to be accurate, not when you come forward several weeks later with information or you come forward 45 years later for a documentary and invent details that you never said before. I'm skeptical of that. So had he said all the stuff he said immediately after the attack, I'd maybe accept it a little bit more, but when you come forward several weeks later, I find that to be a little bit troubling, and so I'm not a big believer in what he said, but what he said definitely has caused a lot of speculation, and who knows, if it's accurate and it's true, then maybe Zodiac just had a weird walk, or as you mentioned, maybe he did get injured somehow and when he was walking away, he was sort of walking gingerly. We just don't know.
Do you think Donald Fouke gave the details of what he saw immediately after the crime and it just wasn't published? Or do you think really they didn't question him? Because coming out on November the 12th, that's a bit of a delay. You thought they would have interviewed everybody.
Well, here's the thing. The memo that he sent, when he sent it, the day before, and I don't have it right in front of me, but the day before or the day of that he sent that memo, there was a big article in the newspaper about the Stine Zodiac attack. I feel that article inspired him to write that memo. So to me, I'm thinking he never reported it or never talked to anyone before that. That's my thinking. And again, we don't have access to all the SFPD reports, so we can't see if and when he reported it. But I do know that, the day he wrote that memo or the day before he wrote that memo, a big article ran in the SF papers about the Stine murder. And I think that prompted him to mail that memo.
And if they'd have interviewed him straight after the crime and got him independently to draw up a sketch of the man he saw going down Jackson, and then the two sketches had virtually mirrored each other, we could have put more credence in this sketch.
Well, and that's what's so confusing about this entire saga. He didn't have any role in creating that sketch. It was all based on the eyewitnesses. So is there a sketch floating around that he later had a part in making that we've never seen? I don't know. Did they not take what he had to say seriously, so they didn't feel the need to make a sketch? I don't know. But it just adds to the overall confusion following Stine's murder that the people known to have seen them aren't all included in the making of the sketch as far as we know. It's only the kids from the window. So, but again, I also look at it as how accurate would Falk have been? He's driving down the street, looking for a black male. He sees this white guy that doesn't look anything like the guy he's looking for at the time. And he's driving. The guy's outside walking. How much detail could he actually provide? I don't know. It's just a frustrating part to Paul Stine's murder is that one of the witnesses that potentially saw Stine's killer didn't even play a role as far as we know in being part of a sketch being created.
And immediately after the crime, they didn't even know it was a Zodiac killer till the 13th, did they? So I'm wondering whether they put a little bit more, I don't want to say effort, into interviewing everybody more rigorously, that if they might have done that more if they'd have realized it was a Zodiac killer immediately.
Well, and here's part of the confusion is, they put out a APB for a black male. So the police are all looking for this mysterious black male suspect. As soon as they put out the corrected description, I think a good police officer, I think someone that knew what they were doing would come forward and say, oh my God, I just saw that guy. Let me go report it to Hosky and Armstrong. Let me come forward and say, hey, I passed him. We were still looking for a black male, but I saw him. He looked like this. We don't know if that happened. Now, in his defense, if somehow that did happen and he did come forward, good for him. But if he waited weeks and weeks until he saw an article in the paper to come forward with that memo, that's a little bit hard to accept for me, because I think a cop that realized that he saw the likely shooter should have come forward immediately with what he knew.
What are your thoughts then on the black male description? Do you think there was an element of racism in that?
Well, I don't know. I don't think they deliberately tried to derail, catching a killer. I don't think they did that on purpose. We don't know all the details about how a black male came to be reported. So I sort of hold a little bit of judgment back on that, because we just don't know the details surrounding all of that. What's important to know is that they did correct it. And when they did, I think Falk should have come forward right at that moment and said, hey, I saw this guy and here's what he looked like. And let me give you full details and a full report. Again, it doesn't appear that he did that, at least from what we can see publicly.
Yeah, he might have had a bit of embarrassment having let the guy slip through his grasp effectively. But let's flip back to the three teenagers again. There's been, and there is still going, a willful effort to promote the tearing of the shirt piece because it helps promote Richard Gaikowski as a suspect in the Zodiac murders, based upon his possible knowledge of the practice of tearing by hand clothing to be used in the medical profession for tourniquets in the field. This comes from a report that you can find on the main forum, where it uses the word torn. But this alone surely isn't enough to conclude this was the case without evidence of a proper forensic analysis of the fibres. Now, one of the teenagers, Rebecca, stated in the later interview, he's stabbing that man, and noted the glint of a knife. It is clear the Zodiac killer didn't need the shirt piece as proof. He had the wallet and keys, which are far easier to remove from the crime scene in far less time. It appears, therefore, his intention all along was to acquire a grisly souvenir. Now, the Zodiac killer could never have predicted in advance the thickness or type of material his victim's clothing would be before the crime. So taking a knife to the crime scene seems like the sensible option. So what are your thoughts on whether you believe the shirt piece was torn, whether it was cut using a knife? Do you think there's evidence that it was torn? And why do you think he took a shirt piece when he already had evidence to prove he was there?
I mean, that's a good point. We don't know. And it could be that he maybe used a knife to start a hole and then tore it once there was a hole made. Or, again, maybe he took a bigger section and brought it home and tore it at home, from the comfort of his own home, and tore down small sections. One to mail to Belli later on, one to mail to SFPD. I don't think we know, but I think it shows people will always take what they want and run with it. And if they have a suspect in mind, as far as, well, I have this suspect that knew how to tear shirts, so that's going to be something I'm going to run with. I think it's human nature that when someone has a suspect in this case, they're going to look at the clues that jump out to them and run with them.
That point in their direction, yeah.
Point in their direction, whether it's the age of the suspect, what he looked like, his physical appearance, that kind of stuff. One thing I've gotten into recently is debate on what Zodiac looked like. A lot of people have this impression that these kids sat there next to Zodiac as he posed for a picture, and they saw him in the light of day, and he was posing for a picture, and they got a perfectly good look at him. This was, I think we determined it was at least 50 feet from their house.
Yes.
And it was at night in the dark. So as far as getting exact appearances, that's why I sort of laugh when people say, well, so-and-so doesn't look like the sketch. Well, again, this wasn't in the light of day, sitting down, these witnesses creating that sketch based on a digital photo or being side by side with the person. They're looking at him from 50 feet away at night. So if every little perfect thing about his face is not captured, or if his age is off, I sort of have an issue with that, because I dare anyone to give an accurate description of someone they've never seen before from 50 feet away at night and be perfect and come away with a sketch that looks identical to them. So I'm always skeptical of someone who says, well, so-and-so doesn't look like this. Again, this wasn't a daytime encounter right next to the person. This was across the street from the attack at night in the dark.
And in terms of the shirt piece, it's one thing tearing a piece of the shirt off, but you have to get through the hem. And also, what happens if the shirt is made of denim? How could the Zodiac possibly know in advance? Because it seemed like this was his choice to do this. It took much longer than it would. He could have chosen any other option, like I said, just mailing in the driver's license. He already had this, the key. Could have mailed in a key. So it does seem like the sensible option to take a knife, because if the shirt was made of denim, he never could have achieved what he achieved.
Yeah, or he would have, at that point, definitely would have needed to use a knife, because tearing denim would be very tough. So, and again, my thinking is the reason for the bloody shirt in the first place is it would be one thing to send a driver's license. It'd be like, okay, here's Paul's driver's license. We know this is the killer. But it wouldn't have the same shock value as a bloody piece of shirt. So I think part of it was to create this dread, this macabre scene of ghoulishness. I think he really wanted to shock the police when they got their hands on this bloody piece of shirt, because it also proved that he killed Paul Stine just like the license would, but it added the shock value too.
It seems to me that ever since Jack Stilts doubted the Zodiac, he went out of his way to prove he was the killer, taking his writing to the crime scene at Lake Berryessa and taking the crime scene at Presidio Heights to his writing on October the 13th via the shirt pieces. Now, the Zodiac killer liked his buttons. So he could have simply ripped off a button or several buttons and just sent them in with his future letters. And this would have been a real simple way. Wouldn't have required a knife, just ripped off 3 or 4 buttons and sent them with the next communications. That would have been the easy option. But so, as you pointed out, it seems like the choice of the shirt piece with the blood on it was for grisly effect.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't see any other reason other than that.
And also, he took a large piece. He could have just took a very small piece, like an inch, which would have sufficed at Presidio Heights, sending in the letter on October the 13th. So do you think the fact he took a large piece was to authenticate future correspondences as well as the October the 13th letter? Because of the doubt that was poured on him by Jack Stilts in the earlier 2 crimes at Lake Herman Road and Blue Rock Springs. So he could have easily took a 1-inch little section of the shirt, but he chose to take a large piece to authenticate later communications. Do you think that's the purpose of the large piece?
Yeah, it absolutely could have been. And, he broke them down into little sections and mailed one to, Melvin Belli. So who knows what he planned to do. I think at some point he probably realized that, hey, if I get caught with this stuff, it's going to convict me probably. So I've got to get rid of it. So I think whatever he had, probably along with Paul Stine's license and keys and everything else, I think at some point that probably wound up being thrown in the trash or in the bottom of a lake someplace.
And finally, in the bus bomb letter, he sent a piece of Paul Stine's shirt piece. So that was unequivocal proof that he was the murderer of Paul Stine, in my opinion, at least. So why did he write at the end of that communication, to prove I am the Zodiac, ask the Vallejo cop about my gun sight? Why did he need to prove any more than the shirt piece?
Yeah, I think he was maybe connecting, saying, hey, don't just stop here, go back and do some busy work. And I think it was a way to keep the cops busy, to keep them sort of building up his persona, by spending time talking to each other, comparing notes. I think he felt important. I think he felt that the more these cops were puzzled over him and teaming up to try and bring down this arch villain, I think that's exactly what he wanted. I think he craved that attention, craved that publicity, and I think he got off on the fact that knowing that these cops would be spending hours of time working to catch him. And I think that's exactly what he wanted.
And like you just said, linking himself back to the first 2 crimes, because in the October the 13th letter, he did also say, I killed those people in the Bay Area, North Bay Area, should I say. So he was continually linking himself back to previous crimes as well as authenticating the crimes he just committed. So that's a good point.
Yeah, and he didn't really take any souvenirs as far as we know from the early crimes. So maybe he thought about it later on and said, hey, I wish I had taken something from the Lake Herman Road scene, or I wish I had taken something from Blue Rock Springs, and then I could mail them in later. So maybe this Paul Stine crime was a chance for him to say, hey, let me provide something to the police so they know I'm the Zodiac, and let me continue to link back to these earlier crimes so they know I'm the arch villain responsible for all of these crimes. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Zodiac Speaking. Please make sure you're subscribed to the show wherever you're listening now so you don't miss a single episode. New episodes of Zodiac Speaking will air every other Saturday. If you want to follow or interact with us on social media, we'd love to hear from you. You can find Zodiac Speaking on Twitter with the handle @PodcastZodiac, or you can search Facebook for Zodiac Speaking Podcast.
And don't forget, you can get plenty of Zodiac details 24/7 by visiting my site at zodiacciphers.com or by going to Mike's site at zodiackiller.net.
If you'd like to help more people find Zodiac Speaking, please take a moment to rate the show and leave a review of it on your favorite podcast player or app. As we wrap up this episode, Rich and I would like to play a preview of a true crime podcast we think you'll like. It's called Crime Divers. Be sure to give it a listen. On behalf of Rich, this is Mike Morford, and I'd like to say thanks again for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Zodiac Speaking.
Hey everyone, I'm Laura.
And I'm Jill.
And we are the hosts of Crime Divers podcast. We are Scottish sisters who tell each other true crime cases the other hasn't heard of.
New episodes are released every Tuesday and you can find us on your favourite podcast platform.
So what are you waiting for? Grab your wetsuit and join us as we dive into the world of true crime.
But remember, watch out for those sharks!